Hello, hello. Welcome to our weekly book club episode of Homeschool Moms Unfiltered. If you're new to our podcast, here's a quick jumpstart tutorial of sorts. First, I'm Amanda, and my amazing co host is.
Hello, I'm Meagan.
Second, we are your messy, imperfect homeschool mom friends. If you're tired of shiny influencers telling you that their homeschool life is always perfect, join the club, specifically our club.
Exactly. We are not that club. Number three, if you are a secular progressive homeschooler feeling very alone in a sea of people who use woke as if it is an insult and are petrified of the government, we are your people. Number four, we mentioned that this is a book club, but know this, you do not have to read the book to come listen to our Cliff Note style digest of the current book. And we don't judge you if you've never read the book and you just come and hang out with us.
Absolutely. So, we are currently reading the Homeschool Starter Guide by Dr. Gina M. Riley. This book promises to help us create and adapt the best education action plan for your needs. So, this is actually our last week reading this book. So, we're glad you're here to join us. If you want to scroll back through our episode queue and start at the beginning to catch up, you're welcome to do that. And if not, you are also completely welcome to just dive in and listen to what we have to say today. So, with that, let's go ahead and get started. We're on chapter 9. We'll start with chapter 9. It's called Your Homeschool's Nuts and Bolts. I will not make a juvenile joke because I am a grown up.
So just to prove that we're not those shiny and the shiny perfect podcasters. Exactly. No, I think you and I both had a similar take on kind of the opening section here. What were your thoughts, Amanda?
Fun page did it start on? Oh, there it is. I'm
97.
an actual page. That's ridiculous. Jeez Louise. So, yeah, I had just said she starts off by offhandedly talking about picking homeschool curriculum. She doesn't exactly say it, but it is worth reiterating that an all in one curriculum is very rarely the best choice when homeschooling. Okay. Does picking something different for each subject you're going to teach take more work? Yep, it sure does. Will it be worth it? Also, yep. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, and I think it just continuously, for me, goes back to that whole thing. The one size fits all education model didn't work in school. It doesn't work in school. It's been failing kids in the United States for decades. And so the thought that a one size fits all process is going to work at home is the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing over and expecting a different result. It's like still the same thing. Just because it's at home, it doesn't mean that it's going to work a ton better if you're picking a one size fits all option. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, totally
No,
agree.
totally. And then she also, in these first couple pages, she uses that school at home language again, which I talked about before. If you didn't tune in for that episode, that's fine. But I really don't like the way that she uses it, especially like she proceeds in this section specifically to show a schedule she uses where her son does core subjects from 9 a.m. to noon and from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. daily, which she has said that if you're following school at home, you're doing it all wrong because you're doing it exactly like the school and you're doing school in the morning and school in the afternoon. And that's pretty, I mean, there's some contradiction there.
Yeah.
And I had
Because
previously said like school at home, there is a not good way to do school at home, right? If you can avoid doing K to 12 at home, please avoid it. That's not really homeschooling. But there are ways to do more traditional homeschooling at home, and it doesn't have to be this negative school at home thing that we often hear and talk about in groups.
yeah, and she's also talked about being an unschooler, and so those core subjects and stuff like that, I was, "Oh, okay. I mean, whatever. There's different ways to unschool and different interpretations, so amazing." Okay, she has a quote here that I didn't see coming. It's by Ree Drummond, who's the pioneer woman on the Food Network. I did one component of this quote from Ree Drummond. I will say I'm gonna read the quote as it's written in the book.
Okay.
I try to be pretty mindful about using words like crazy flippantly or OCD flippantly because it's not terribly respectful. So please don't get upset with me because I don't think I would have worded this way, but I'm reading a quote. So she talks about, she says, when I first started out, the fear and uncertainty I felt about homeschooling caused me to go a little berserk. In preparation for that first year, I created an intricate color coded chart that accounted for each and every 30-minute time slot from 6 a.m. to 4 p.m. I followed my psychotic color coded schedule to a T for 4 days, then gave up. My goals are yearly these days. And I think it's interesting because we are seeing it's September when we're recording this, which is one of the reasons we picked a book that's foundational in nature because there's so many new homeschoolers. But I've seen so many charts get posted in the last month where it's, is this enough? Is it too much? Would you structure this differently? Are you doing reading and math every day or are you altered? There's a lot of color coded charts in the world of new homeschooling, right? And I mean, you have to start somewhere. So it makes sense, right? But sometimes, like, I'm seeing ones where play is scheduled and like free time is scheduled and reading is scheduled. And I'm like, whoa. So just know if you're new and you're listening to this or you're considering homeschool, you do not need to schedule play. You do not, play should just be like a thing. And I'm a huge fan of that saying, never wake a sleeping baby. Like, I'm a huge, like, never interrupt healthy, beautiful, organic playtime. Also, like, if your kids are like knee deep in something and they're having a blast and you're like, the schedule says that we need to start math right now. I'm not talking about a math class that you've signed up for and paid for and stuff like that. But if it's just time for you to transition to the kitchen table and start math, they can play, right? I mean, if they're in the middle of a game, there's learning there too. You can do math later. So you do not need a color coded chart schedule thing that's that tight. Maybe this book does talk about setting yearly goals, monthly goals, weekly goals. That's great, right? I mean, I think there's something to be said for having some structure and whatnot. But if you feel bound by a schedule that's that constrictive, you're probably going to miss out on a lot of joyful learning experience as well.
Okay, you might.
You might.
I'm not gonna let you run that that show. You might, okay? But it might work for you and it might work
It
for your
might.
kiddo. Like, I know for us, when and again, we were different because we didn't actually really start homeschooling until kids were sent home during the pandemic. And I had a kindergartner who had been in a Montessori kindergarten and he came home and they were not able to send Montessori kindergarten home with the kids, but they did send one of these kind of color coded things. And at first I was like, oh, I don't really want to do that. And we needed it. Like, and I have talked about this in our regular podcast. My kiddo really does significantly better with structure. So when we were first starting out, the color coding helped him transition better. He needed those and he still does. We do a lot of transition stuff and the 5-minute warnings and then this kind of thing. And so the color coding absolutely helped. And we did have play scheduled in, but it was more that thing of every 15 to 30 minutes we stopped to do. And again, this was during the early days of the pandemic, right? When everyone was inside and we were in a condo. And so we weren't going anywhere, right? We were in the heart of the city. And so it was like every 15 or 30 minutes, stop and do some cosmic kids yoga or do something like this. And it saved our sanity at that
Right.
time. And it was a really important way for us to structure things. Now, as we have gotten used to doing this at home, we still have a lot of structure. It's not nearly laid out like that, and it doesn't need to be visually color coded because he can read, right? And so he doesn't need to see a visual color coding anything. But I can see how when you're working with an elementary age kiddo, a color coded thing that helps visually move them from one task to the next and things like that could absolutely help in your life. Now, it should not create more stress for you. This is one of
Right.
those things. Like, and I think that's what this quote is talking about, right? She gave herself a lot of stress by trying to fit something into a schedule that didn't work. Whereas you can have a schedule like that does work for you if you're actually paying attention to what in the world works for you.
Which is important, not just when it comes to scheduling, but pretty much all things.
All
Right.
things, yes. Yeah. Pay
All things.
attention.
Okay. So would you say now, because I just have a vague idea of what your homeschooling looks like because we don't live together and co-parent. So, but I feel like we have what I refer to as instead of a schedule, I call ours a rhythm, right? We have a groove. We have it's not really a regimented, but it flows and it ebbs and flows. There's a routine to it. And from what you've said, I feel like maybe you're in the same boat. Like you have where your mornings are more academic, your afternoons are dedicated to this. Then there's like self-directed enjoyment time? Like you've got a rhythm. Would that be a fair statement, or would you not describe it that way?
We're more structured than that for sure. So he has a checklist of things that he needs to do for the entire week. And it's everything like Beast Academy. And then next to it, it says 20 to 30 minutes at a time. World history, 20 minutes, geography, 10 minutes, and each and everything we do. Hearth and story spelling, 5 minutes, hearth and story grammar, 10 minutes, hearth and story novel study, 15 minutes. And there's a specific amount of time that he's expected to do. And it's that thing. It's because he uses that visual timer that we have talked about before. So
Hmm.
he knows how much time to put on his visual timer so he doesn't waste the whole day away. And a combination of between what we both prefer, he does it in the mornings, generally speaking, because he wants to just knock it out. And then he goes on and does his self-directed stuff at the end, whether it's more learning of what he wants or he's working on some new Lego creation or whatever that may be. But it's pretty set. When he was younger, I put an order of what he should do and when it needed to be done, and I did drive that. Now that
Hmm.
he's in 5th grade, we're definitely working on, well, this is what has to be done by the end of the day on Friday. And if you haven't finished all of this by the end of the day on Friday, you're gonna finish it on Saturday. Like this one, so we're but that's working around those executive skills things,
Hmm.
right? These are the things you have to do. He can finish it all in 4 days if he chooses to work that way. If he doesn't, I don't think he's ever. And there are days, not days, there are weeks, right, that instead of finishing it in 4 days, he does it on the 6th day because he just didn't have the motivation to get it wrapped up. And then there are days where we have other stuff going on, right? And so for that week, I go through and I mark off things. Like, I don't expect you to do half of this stuff because we have other stuff going on, and that's not my expectation for this week. But yeah, we definitely have a lot more structure between the 2 of us, part of it driven by him and part of it driven by me, than what you guys have in your house.
So is the weekly to-do list,
Mhm.
is it something where the requirements are the same each week and then you're changing out maybe specifics where it's like for Hearth and Story, it's number 5, and for this, it's module 2 or something like, is it where the list is always the same, where it's like always the subject and the timer is the same, but then you're noting for him what component within that thing, and then he's checking them off? Or is he just like going, if it's like a 20-minute requirement, is he just continuing 20 minutes forward at a time constantly?
It's mostly just 20 minutes at a time, like, moving forward. I make the schedule for our science so that doesn't move through, and he could find out what he's doing in world history, but he doesn't bother. He asks me each week what that looks like. And we'll talk about that a little later because it does depend on whether or not you're creating your curriculum or you're buying and using curriculum. We do buy and use a lot of set curriculum. So it makes a lot of that quite easy because you're just working through it, right? Michael Clay Thompson, you get a thing that tells you how to finish the curriculum for the entire year in 29 weeks. Okay, thank you very much. We'll work through that. We don't always line up, right? Sometimes we go a little faster so that we can take a few weeks off. And sometimes we do all of the reading and the novel study while we're traveling. So we only have to take one book instead of a lot. But for the most part, I can just plug and play with stuff that I know that we like and that I know is working.
Mhm.
So the checklist he has changes on a quarterly basis, but not significantly. Usually more around what other classes he's asked to take or what other things he's asked to add in.
Okay, perfect. I was just curious because I was like, that would probably be helpful if somebody's okay. Well, how much am I changing that each week, or
Yeah.
how standard is it? So,
I
so
try to be lazy on it. Like it's and I will write like in pen myself. It lives in Excel. I print it off. Once a quarter I might go in and change things a little, but for the
tweak.
most part, like for that week, I may write down on it what we have, but his list doesn't really change. It's my list that's tracking. Yeah, we did actually finish unit 2. We did actually finish whatever it is.
And then within that chart, he has the option if he only wants to do world history like all day today and plow through oodles of it and ignore everything else, he can, as long as by the end of the week, everything's balanced out and he's done it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah. So I think we speak a similar language, right? Because to me, that's a rhythm, right? Where like each week is similar in the one before, right? Like there's a pattern but you're not saying from 9:15 to 9:42, this is what you're doing. And from
Yeah.
9:42 to 9:50, you can have a snack. But then at 9:50, we're doing this, right? Like that to me is the difference. But a
Mhm.
rhythm is okay. Every week we're in my definition, right? Every week we get these core things done. How they get done, when they get done. There's fluidity to that. It's
Mhm.
just these are the things we're looking to accomplish in a week. So I think we go about doing the things differently, and which stands to reason anyway, since my kids are a little bit older and we homeschool differently. But we're still setting at the beginning of the week, you have an idea of what that week's going to look like, and by the end of the week, hopefully, it look like that, right? Like
Yeah.
best
No, yeah. I
intentions,
mean,
right?
that's it. Exactly. But I think that's a great example of how you can, in some ways, you're doing the same things, but a little bit differently. And then in other ways, you're not doing the same things at all, but the end result is quite similar. And that's truly the glory of homeschooling, right? You
Mm,
can find people who are doing things in that whole range and it works.
yeah,
We got way off topic. Let's see. What's our
but I
next?
think it was,
Yeah.
but
I
I
think it was a useful discussion.
Yeah, because it's true. Like it was, I mean, I think one of our most popular episodes that we've done was on how to create a homeschool schedule. And I
Mhm,
think that's like super meaty, like real life. This is what I do every week. This is
mhm,
how it plays out during the week. This is what I do. This is what he does. This is where it's flexible. This is where it's not flexible. And I think those are like when we talk about nuts and bolts, I think that's some of what confuses people to an extent.
mhm.
Was I have a blank sheet of paper. What the hell do I
Yes.
do now?
Oh my god. No.
So,
Yeah.
and I think it dovetails in with the next section, right? Because it talks about how to create a homeschool schedule. And you already explained some of this, right? She talks about yearly, quarterly, weekly, block scheduling, loop scheduling. She's got a
Mhm,
whole lot going on here. So I made a note that I think we're a combination of yearly goal setting. Uh, so we're goal setters, not necessarily schedulers, because we don't have I have pretty goal driven kids. So if they've set a goal, they will achieve it for the most part. Unless they get into something sometimes and realize, hey, I set this goal, but I need to tweak it. And I'm not opposed to that because corporations do that all the time, right? They set goals
mhm,
for the year and then their focus shifts and they change goals. You're allowed to do that. So, but generally speaking, they're pretty goal driven. If they decide to do something, they'll do it. They'll do it on time. They'll set their own motivating factors around it or end results that they'd like to see, and that happens. So I think, yeah, we're a combination of yearly, semester, and weekly. And I say semester because now that my kids have gotten older and they're doing a lot of college focused things, the semester is like an external imposed goal setting thing, right? So we started this year knowing like the school that my daughter attends does trimesters. And so we started this year knowing she was going to take off the first trimester to work on personal projects. And then what class she was going to take the second trimester, what class she was going to take the third trimester. So we already had that planning done and we knew where the weight and the significance within those times would be, where her breaks would be, where she could fit in things in between those breaks and stuff like that. And then our weekly goal setting, and I don't think I've talked about this on the podcast before. I think I've talked about it just in other settings, but I have three neurodivergent kids and smartwatches have been like the
mhm,
greatest thing that's ever happened. And I know you have your scheduling jam and kind of your routine keeping, but I have three kids and I work. And it was really hard for me to constantly have to remind them of what they had and when they had it. And then my super ADHD kiddo, I could tell him at 4:40 that he has a class at 5 and he still needs a reminder 5 minutes to 5. So it was like
mhm,
I literally could not take that off my mental plate until I knew he was sitting at the computer because from 4:40 to 5, goodness only knows what he would get distracted by.
mhm,
And so my weekly planning is really simple because I go into all of their Google accounts and just plunk everything down on their calendars and they get two reminders, they get a 15. So it's interesting. My boys get a 15-minute reminder and a 5-minute reminder because that's what works for them. From the 5-minute reminder, I feel pretty confident that they won't get distracted and miss something. But my daughter moves like a snail. She's just a slow mover. That's just how she's always been. So she gets a 20 and a 10 because 5 minutes for her would be panic stricken. She needs to already be sitting down at 5 minutes. So, and that's been super helpful because I don't have to hunt them down and go, you have this thing. I told you you have this thing, right? I
Yeah.
used to print out a paper calendar and they never looked at it. And so it is literally attached to their bodies and it buzzes and tells them where they need to be and when. And it has made my life so much easier. But she goes into a whole bunch of different scheduling. So what does it look like for you, Amanda?
Yeah, well, we don't have a smartwatch. That's not we have one. It doesn't get worn except when we're actually, like, going out into public and I run the risk of losing him somewhere, so that would
Mhm.
not work for us. We do rely on Alexa, and it's funny you mentioned because we have a thing where he gets a 7-minute reminder for any class that requires, like, for art class where he has to get out, like, a specific notebook and
Supplies.
specific supplies, yeah. So that's 7 minutes because that's the amount of time we found that he like, gives him enough time to do exactly what he needs and sits down and we're good. And then it's a 4-minute reminder for any class that he just needs to go and sit down for because more
Yep.
than 4 minutes and he's got time to do something else, and then he might not actually get to class. So we do a similar thing. I will say though, and I just said it a little bit earlier, that our planning so she talks about a homeschool schedule, and later on, she talks about lesson planning, and for me, those go super hand in hand because my I have this, like, weekly lesson plan that I do for the whole year, and that won't work for everyone because not everyone can be flexible about it. But for me, I sit down at the beginning of August and I look at all of our curriculum and I say, okay, we've got 28 weeks of this and we've got 32 weeks of this and and I sit down and I scope it out. And I know that I'm going to take a full week off at Thanksgiving and I'm going to take 4 weeks off at the holidays so that we can do travel and around spring break time, I'm going to schedule an easy 3 weeks around spring break because we'll probably do a family trip. We'll probably do a camp or two with some of his public school classmates or like friends and like scheduling those out it helps for us that we do homeschool year round. Our summer is definitely lighter, but in the summer, it doesn't matter if we didn't finish the other curriculum. And sometimes we finish things early just because it was easy and we were bombing through it. Like we're doing this new grammar curriculum. We've only been doing it for 2 weeks and he's on like lesson 26 or something. And I don't care. It's one less thing we'll
Yeah.
have to do at the end of the year. That's fine. Does that mean that my year-long weekly plans are off? Yeah, it does, but I don't really care, it'll be fine. But so I put that giant spreadsheet together at the beginning of the year, and then I don't do much else with it except each week go and see, "Well, hey, what did I plan for us to do for science this week?" Like, well, which unit were we gonna cover, and what are we gonna do with that? Or I just I like really easy plug and play, right? I don't have and we've talked about this before, right? I have a disability, and one of those things is a lot of brain fog and that kind of stuff. And so I need it to be something that if I'm having a rough week or even just a rough day, I don't have to think that hard about it. And because we buy curriculum that's set up in weekly things, it's pretty easy and plug and play there.
Yeah. You can roll it out, which works.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I can completely see that. I like that. So then she talks about block and loop scheduling. And I
Mm.
was happy she did because I feel like this comes up a lot in Facebook groups and stuff like that. And I could imagine being new and just being like, what are these blocks and loops people are talking about? What is happening here? So I've not used block and loop scheduling, clearly. Do you have familiarity with either of these, Amanda? Is this your jam at all?
Not really. So she talks about how block looks similar to most brick and mortar schools these days. And I think most of us, if we went to a regular school, we probably experienced block scheduling, right? Where you do 3 or 4 things a day and you do this and then the next day, and it's chunks of time, right? Sometimes it's only 40 minutes, but a lot of block scheduling is more like an hour and a half per thing, and you go a little deeper on it. And that's just that again, it's that idea of a set chunk. This is the time that we do this. This is the time that we do that. And we're not that strict, right? We just talked about that. We're not that set,
Right.
but it works for some people. And it does, I mean, it happens for us just like it happens for you with the classes that we pay for, right? On Thursdays at noon, we have art because I pay for art. That's our block scheduling.
Yeah.
The loop scheduling, that was a new one for me, and I have to say, like, I try to be flexible, but that really just made me, like, all sorts of anxious.
Yeah. So, I mean, okay. So, first to tell you, so a loop schedule is a rotating to do list for scheduling. So, she lists out an example schedule: ELA, history, biology, algebra, PE, music, art, foreign language. And so, basically, you just start at the top and you work your way through, and you just keep checking it off. And when you get to the bottom, you start again with the new one. And I was like, I was just looking at this thinking this would never work. And my one thought was your kiddo, Amanda, because history was the second one on the list. And I'm like, is he ever getting past history? Is that ever happening? He'd be like, nope, can't move on yet. Still not done with history,
Not
right?
done. Yeah.
And so I feel like that would be the case with most kids in certain things. Like I have a super artistic kiddo. She'd never move past art ever. I mean, she'd be like, but I mean, oh my gosh, I mentioned last week that we went to see Jane Goodall and we're sitting there. It started a little bit late and she's looking at something on the Met's website about the history of kid skin leather and book bindings and whatever and all this kind of stuff, right? I mean, there's no end to how deep she's going to go if you give her a loop and say, hey, when you're
Yeah.
done with art, move on to foreign language, as if, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, even if you set for me, the thing was is even if you set limits around it, I know this is your favorite, but please don't spend more than 3 hours on it or whatever that looks like. She explains the loop as being like you have a list of 10 things, and if on Monday you only get through 3, that's fine. On Tuesday, you start at the 4th. And so then you would, when maybe on Tuesday you get through 4. And so that means on Wednesday you start at the ninth thing on your list. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't, who is keeping track of that?
Yeah.
Who has the bandwidth to be like, well, what did we finish up with yesterday? So let's start with it. Like, oh,
Well, then imagine you have multiple kids looping at different paces. Right?
like, so this one is on 2 and this one is on 4 and this one is on 7. And I like my life to be utter chaos. No, thank you.
Yeah.
And it would never work. We decided to start calling my kiddo Winston because that works. It would never work for Winston, right? Like that amount of just chaos, right? We have talked a lot. He like structure helps him a lot. And it is different for us because we're a family that just likes to soak up knowledge, right? We
Right.
will soak up knowledge on anything, about anything. It's, oh, hey, that's something new. Oh, that's interesting. I mean, like, he, yeah, he gets it from me, right? He comes by it honestly, so I can't be upset. But just, I don't, I can't. Loop is not for us.
Loop was a
Uh,
bit much. Yeah. Yeah. So I made a note on 108, but you've got a note, I think, that comes prior to that about your kind of a general thought.
so I just said that I I think that this author does a decent job of exploring really basic, hey, let's start homeschooling ideas. I think this book is good for that. But I do also think that sometimes she unintentionally presents a pretty limited, narrow way of doing things, right? If you pick this up or you're following along with us, it's a great place to start. I think it's a great place to start. It's an easy read, it's fun, it's broken down well, it's quick to get through, and it definitely has some helpful things and ideas in it. But please do not think that this is what you're limited to.
Yeah. Good point. Mhm. Yeah, I completely agree. And really, you could read 5 more books that are foundational starter books and they'll explain it in different ways, right?
Yeah, all
But I
different.
do,
Yeah.
to your point, I like the fact that she describes methodology and styles of homeschooling and terminology that you're going to hear. And I mean, if you think about it, we've both been in Facebook groups for homeschooling for so long, and you hear company names and curriculum names and terminology and thought processes all the time. I mean, just the number of people who get homeschooling, deschooling, and unschooling confused
Mhm,
when they're new because they all sound similar and it can be hard
mhm.
to keep track. So just having this guidebook of delineation between those things, I think could be, to your point, super helpful as long as you just don't be like, well, the book said, and
Yeah.
I could only do the things that are in the book.
Yeah, that's it. It's not the rules and regulations of homeschooling. It's like a foundational jumping off point of homeschooling.
Exactly. All right. So I made a note on page 108 and 109, which if you're watching on video is a chart of it's a scheduling grid, right? And it's a sample weekly homeschool schedule. All right. Now, reminder, if you're new here, I am not a structured school homeschool person, right? We are We've been unschooling for years and years. It totally suits us. So is it just me? Because Amanda's more structured, but this feels like a lot. Doesn't this feel a bit intense? Or is that just me? You can say it's just me if it is.
I would say to an extent it's just you.
Okay.
But again, it's that thing. It depends on how you homeschool and what your kiddo wants, right? I could see us doing similar to this much work, but
Okay.
my kiddo was going to be really happy doing it because a lot of it is like,
Up his alley.
yeah, I mean, like in this specific example, they are learning almost everything through some sort of history by going to a bank. When that's algebra. In algebra, they go to a bank. In English language arts, they're comparing the Wizard of Earthsea with the Lord of the Rings and using the New York Times. Those are all things that he would absolutely do for fun that we would just talk about, right? Then there's different sports every day. At this point, we're now signed up for 3 different sports things. So that totally happens in our world. Then, I mean, language every day, we do that. Music every day, we do that. Talk about genetics, look up genetics, watch a video on genetics. Yeah, research the Federalist Papers. Yep, he's going to do that. Go visit a copy of the local library. We do that. Watch Hamilton. He'd happily do that. Discuss the American Revolution every day, all day, if you gave him the chance. Read some papers at night. So I I think this is one of those examples. If you have a kid who really likes learning and you're paying attention to how they like learning and you're finding a way that you tap into that in a lot of different ways, you could end up with a schedule like this and everyone would be happy. I'm sure with Astrid specifically, you could find a way for her to happily have a schedule that was this intense
That's true.
if it was all around fashion and tied into fashion in one way or another. But
Yeah.
that's not every kid, and that's
Right.
okay. So
I
I think
think,
this an example of a perfect example of it can look like this.
right.
It does not have to look like this, and it
That makes
is
sense.
perfectly okay if it doesn't look like this.
So some of what got me in here was like, I was talking to somebody not that long ago about they were planning to go to DC and they had sent this massive list of stuff to do in DC in 3 days. And I
Hopes
was
and
like,
dreams.
and I was just, that's too much, right? And
Mhm,
so to your point about style, that's what I'm getting from this is our style is we don't like too much.
mhm,
I have 3 avid learners who love information, who love to learn, but they don't, first of all, they don't like to ping pong all over the place, which is what's happening here because
mhm,
there's a lot of everything happening here. And they like to be intense on one thing at a time.
mhm,
And then the other thing is I have introverts. I have hardcore introverts. And so visit Edward Hopper's house or attend Picasso lecture at the library. They are a one outing a day type group, right? And then there's a recovery period after that
mhm,
outing where they get to marinate on what just happened and what's coming next and all of
mhm.
that, right? Now, like the day that they have attend Picasso lecture at the library, there's also a walk run there. Okay, like we will totally go. Oh, I just said the W word and she's here and she didn't even pop her little head up.
She
Usually
is
we have
tired.
I know she's a tired out doggo today. Usually we have to spell so not only do we have to spell the W word, but now we've had to give it a code word because even spelling it, she's figured it out.
Yeah, she's
So yeah, so but we're still gonna go to the PARK as it were on that day for our outdoor time, but we're not going to write essays and like she's visiting a bank and going to a Picasso lecture on the same day. My crew is not doing that. No. And I'll give you an example. I myself just alone went to the Holocaust Museum over the weekend. We were in DC. The boys were at an event and I was quote unquote free. So I drove into DC. I'd always wanted to go to that Holocaust Museum and I'd never been. And I forgot about city life and parking meters and all reality once I got into the museum because I was having the most enriching, incredible experience. But yeah, I mean, I was in the same museum for over 3 hours. And then when I was done, I was tired, right? It's a lot to take in and it's an experience and the whole thing. And I'm like, so the thought of doing 7 other activities on that say, I'm like, yeah, no, that's not happening. So, but if it does work for some, that's okay. But if it doesn't work for you, that's okay too.
Yeah, that's okay too. The
This
other
is too
things
much for me.
that we're missing on this is that she also lives in a city. And I think if you live in a city, it's a little bit different, right? Because you have probably taken the subway to get wherever you're going, and you might hit up 2 or 3 things. You might plan your schedule so that, hey, when we go to the library for this, we're also gonna be next to we do that, like, we're going to the library, we're gonna get this, and we're gonna read about this. There's this new exhibit at the library, so we'll pick up the books, we'll do that. And then we'll go over to Petco Park and look at their new exhibit that they put up there and read the information there because we're already down there
Right.
and like we're in that area. So we'll do those things and we'll do that in the morning or in the afternoon and we'll balance that with our other stuff. But it's a little bit different, like just lifestyle if you live
Yeah.
in a city and you plan in the city versus if you're living in a town or in the suburbs where, okay, we're going to go into the city to go to this museum and it's an all day thing, right?
Yeah.
So I think that probably plays into some of her scheduling as well.
That's true. I can totally see that. Okay, then she talks about standardized testing, which we just did a whole episode on SAT, PSAT, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep.
But this, of course, can be standard testing or standardized testing at all levels, not just college prep
Mhm.
section of standardized testing.
Yeah, so
So, what do you have?
I just said on page 113, she starts talking about standardized testing, and she asserts that many states require homeschoolers to submit standardized test scores each year. And I'm going to say, I don't think many states require that.
True.
I think some states do. And it might be fair to say that many states require you to complete some sort of standardized test. But this idea that you have to complete it and submit it, that's not actually that common in my
Mm-mm.
experience.
I've homeschooled in 4 states and I've never submitted a test to anyone. Like, so,
Have
yeah,
some of them required that you take them each year?
one.
One of those states
One
required.
out of
Yeah.
4. Yeah. So, and we had a list of tests that we could choose from, and we administered it. We did nothing with it once we administered it. It was like the silliest activity because you could pick I picked the CAT, which is the most useless test there is, in my opinion.
I'm gonna
And
disagree. I think the cat is good for helping you see if you've really missed something, right? In our example, in our experience, he was in second grade and he took the cat and he like tested completely out of the elementary level, except for punctuation.
okay.
And he missed a bunch, like every punctuation question they had, he got wrong. And it made me realize, like, oh, I just assumed because he reads so much that he got punctuation. I need to double back and make sure that we do a couple lessons on punctuation. So I did find, even though for the most part it's not particularly useful on specific skills, if there's some kind of a broad thing that you just, you forgot to I mean,
It
I
might
just
show you that.
yeah, like that kind of a thing might pop up because it doesn't ask too many questions. It's pretty quick. It doesn't take that long. And the questions are generally pretty easy.
Yeah.
But yeah, if there's a big thing that's like an easy thing to be like, oh, yeah, we can cover that in 2 days and we will have fixed that skill, which therein lies the problem with the cat, right? If there's something that it points out, oh, you don't know this, and you're like, oh, I can cover it in 2 days and we fixed it, like it's probably not the best standardized test out there. But
Yeah.
it can be useful. And I do think like it's low stress. You can
Yeah.
do it at home. You can do it untimed. It's really affordable. If you want to do something that's super easy that you track a year to make sure that there's some forward progress, even if it's like for your husband who's not on board or he's not sure,
Okay.
or like the in-laws are like up your ass about what's happening. Do
The
this every
cat's perfect for
year.
that.
Yes.
Or a custody issue and you need to prove that your kids are excelling in homeschooling,
Mhm.
cat test.
Cat the one, yeah. And I mean, the thing is, it will show you, right? It will show you if your kids are way below grade level, and then okay, I mean, if even the cat's saying the kids are below grade level, we need to, like, do a little bit of something.
Well, or your kid is an anxious wreck test taker or, something
Mhm.
like that. So even which is the same for all standardized tests, not just the cat,
True.
that
But
it
that is
still
also
might not be a
useful, yeah,
valid thing.
but that is also useful information, right? If
Right.
your kiddo does this and it looks like that, then you know that you need to look at something,
Right.
and
Yep.
that's useful. That's helpful information.
Yeah. So she breaks down a bunch of tests. She's got the Iowa test here, the Stanford Achievement Test, the California Achievement Test, which is that one, the CAT, personalized assessment. I will say I made a note. So this is a rather funny phone call that I made. So the sources that she gives in the book for the CAT test are BJU Press and Christian Liberty Press, which are both, I know, are both religious sources.
Mhm.
When I had to give the CAT, I administered it twice, I think, when we lived in North Carolina. I got it from Academic Excellence. And I was like 99% sure Academic Excellence was a secular resource, but I
Mhm.
wasn't entirely sure. So I went on their website and there wasn't really like an about us or anything. And I was like, well, I really want to offer a secular resource since we're a secular podcast if people want to do that. Plus, there's usually a coupon code every year for the CAT test on Academic Excellence. It used to be first CAT every single year, all uppercase.
Mhm.
I don't know if it still is, but ask if you live in a state where testing is required or whatever, just ask in a homeschool group. Somebody's always going to have the CAT coupon code for you. But so I called their phone number just to say, are you a secular resource? So I call and I'm like, asking, are you secular? Blah, blah, blah. And the girl was like, we're not a church. We do standardized testing. And I was like, no, I understand that you do standardized testing, but I'm trying to figure out if you're a secular resource or if you have a religious affiliation. And we do tests for students, like for school. And she just did not understand the question. But we did finally, after a really long circuitous route, determine that the CAT is secular if you get, or that Academic Excellence is a secular resource for the CAT test. So if that's important to you for how you spend your money, there you go. Okay.
I love it. We also used Academic Excellence when we did the CAT. And I Academic Excellence, I don't know if they had it when you did it because I'm not sure when you had to do it, but when we did it, you could pay a little extra for a more thorough score report. So it wasn't just the one-page breakdown. And so I did pay like the extra 15 or 20 bucks for a several page score report that showed me exactly which questions he got wrong, which was how I was able to identify, oh, it's punctuation that he is struggling with, not grammar, not but specific punctuation. And so, I mean, I think it's a good source if you're wanting to do something like that. Because we homeschool with a charter, we have to do the actual state standardized test. So we do CASP, but it doesn't start until third grade. I hear all over all the time people talk about the amount of standardized testing that happens in kindergarten. And there are not many. I mean, I know it sounds bad and none of us want that, but I will also say there are not very many states that actually do standardized testing in kindergarten for your kiddo. Most state standardized tests don't start until third grade.
Thank goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Florida might have been fourth grade even, if I remember correctly. But yeah, the other thing that she's got here, just as a quick note, is on the bottom of or towards the bottom of 115, she's got the PASS test is a popular, blah, blah, the PASS test is popular among homeschooling families because it is an untimed test. And I just wanted to note that the CAT also offers a timed and an untimed. So
Yeah.
there's also a paper test and an online test. So that's not the only untimed test. If you're looking at this and thinking, oh, I have a kid who stresses about time tests, I must do this test. There's other options as well. They're just not noted here. So
Yeah,
yeah,
that's it. And this is stuff, I mean, it's useful here, but Google is your friend.
yeah,
There's so many options out there. And you can even go on the Academic Excellence website. They offer a lot of different ones and they tell you which ones are this and how to
yeah.
all
Just
that
don't
jazz.
ask the girl if they're secular.
But I mean, that in and of itself tells you,
Yeah,
like, I at a corporation that just
yeah.
makes money. I don't know. Like, religious what? I
Yeah,
feel
she's like, "Why
fairly
would testing and religion be connected?" And I'm like, "Oh, honey, you must be new."
yeah. Yeah. I feel fairly confident that if they were had a religious affiliation, everyone who worked there would know.
Yeah.
Maybe not.
Exactly. I think we have a similar note on 121. What did you have?
So I just put once again, we're discussing the benefits of teaching video games and interactive media. She's pretty pro those things in here. I'm not exactly pro those things, but it can be helpful if that's something that you're looking at and you're wanting some ideas. And then she specifically mentions or recommends a blog called Freedom to Learn. I don't know it. I haven't read anything about it, but it seemed like it could be useful for someone who was wanting to learn more about that. You hear it a lot, right? "Oh, my kids only want to do video games. What do we do?" And this seems to be a resource that talks about how they
Mhm.
can learn with video games and that'll be fine.
Yeah. Looks like a good thing to check out, if nothing else. Okay, then she's got a section on managing your resources. There's
So
a
we
lot
have
here.
thoughts.
Yeah, we
We
do.
have thoughts.
So the first is she starts off by saying homeschooling is an amazing educational alternative. However, it does cost money to do it well. And I feel like there's a lot of, okay, so it's like, how long is a piece of string? The answer is going to be all over the place, right? So,
Mhm.
first of all, what is doing it well? And second of all, what is some money, right? There's a lot of ambiguity there. I think you can homeschool very well on a budget if you're resourceful and you put the time into pulling it together and things like that. But I also think that it's important to say public school isn't free. My kids went to public school for a little bit, a very short period of time. Every time I turned around, they wanted money. And we lived
Yeah.
in a very well funded district for public school. Oh my gosh, we need money for this. And there's a color run, and we're selling popcorn, and we're doing this, and Christmas gifts for specials teachers, which I'm all in favor of. They deserve presents too. Oh my gosh, every time I turned around, they wanted money or they needed something. So I feel like the alternative isn't necessarily free either. I feel like you can do a good job. I feel like this kind of sets people up who are tentative about coming into homeschooling with a very tight budget of being like, I'm not going to be able to do it well.
Well, I think you have to make sure you read the whole paragraph, right? Because the
Yeah.
very next thing she says is, remember, I homeschooled my son as a single mother on a very strict budget. So I know firsthand that creating an incredible educational experience for your child with little or no money is possible. But it is crucial to consider potential exes, right? And so I do think there's that. And it's one of those things, right? We, in our family and yours as well, we are very fortunate to not have to stop and think, can we afford internet this month? And her point is, you're probably going to need to make sure that you schedule in internet access because you're going to want to use the free resources from the library. But a lot of the things you're going to want to use will require internet access because you want the free subscriptions or the ebooks or the documentaries or the movies or whatever. And you can get those things for free, but you have to have internet to be able to get them from the library because if you're just using minutes on a prepaid plan, you're going to burn through them way too fast, those kinds of things. And I mean, that is a reality. There are plenty of Americans and anyone else from around the world listening who have to make
Yeah.
sure that they include internet into their budget. And I would say actually the amount that she includes in here is really low. Like
Yeah.
this,
Internet for $20 to $30 a month. Not me.
right? Yeah, I was like, wow, I'm not sure where you're getting that kind of internet price these days.
Yeah.
So I mean, like I think there is that. And yes, you can get lots of free resources online, but you do have to have a printer and you have to be able to afford to buy paper and ink, or you have to have enough money to go to the library and pay 5 cents a sheet to print it off at the library kind of thing. I mean, so I think it does cost money, even doing it the cheapest way possible. But it doesn't have to be a lot.
Yeah. I agree. And I agree. You made a comment about Chromebook, and I agree. You're not a Chromebook fan?
No. And because we started out with a Chromebook, we actually
Yes.
had a couple Chromebooks and it was one of those things. As we got into it, we found so many things just did not work right on a
Mhm.
Chromebook. Unless you really can't afford anything else, I would not recommend wasting your money on a Chromebook if you're actually going to do homeschooling because they're just so many things that do not function well on a Chromebook as far as like educational sites and Zoom kind of things,
Yep.
online classes, a lot of that kind of stuff. And she says that you're spending $500 to $600 on a Chromebook. I mean, first off, you can get a Chromebook for $100.
Yeah, you
We have a
can. Yeah.
Chromebook for $100, but you can also get a pretty decent computer these days for 500 to $600, like an actual laptop. I know we spent 450 on our most recent laptop. I think it was Black Friday deals, but still, I mean, like that it's definitely possible to get a decent laptop for uh, less than $500.
Yeah. And we're planning we're going to have a break over the holidays between season one and season two. And we're going to do little mini episodes in that time frame. And one of them will be what to look for when buying a laptop, right? Which is,
Mhm.
I'm not host. I'm going to literally rope my husband into it because he's the one who always sends me a link and says, buy this one at Best Buy. And that's what I do. So we'll figure out what he's doing to narrow it down to that thing. What are the specs he's looking at and all that. So if you don't have somebody who knows those things in your sphere, I'll loan you my husband for the day and we'll get him to share those tips and tricks with us during that episode.
Yeah, no, that'll be great. I totally researched all the different websites and what was recommended, and I put a list of 4 together and sent it to my husband and was like, "Here's what I found. Do you have a strong preference? And he was like, absolutely not these two, like
Yeah.
looking at whatever it was that he looked at. Cause he has also worked in computers since he was in college. So yeah, if you don't know, come get some expert recommendations, right? The other thing she mentions specifically in this when she's talking about managing your teaching resources is that a boxed curriculum costs $500 to $800. And that's probably true if you're buying a full boxed curriculum, but I can pretty much guarantee you that it's got way more in it than you need. And if you buy what you actually want and mix and match it, it costs a lot less, generally speaking. So I know for us, with our mix and match curriculum, we use some expensive ones. Like we don't use all cheap ones. Like our Hearth and Story is 25 bucks and then you have to print it. But Michael Clay Thompson, that's 400 bucks easy. We usually buy it secondhand, gently used, but all in our box curriculum is not coming anywhere close to $800 a year. So there's
Nice.
definitely ways to do it that it doesn't have to cost that much. Don't let that number scare you.
And then if you gently use it yourself, you can resell it again. So
Absolutely.
you're
Yeah.
still not out, even if you're spending $600 and you break that down, that's $50 a month. But even if you can get half of that back,
Mhm.
you're not at a huge monthly
Yeah,
spend.
that's it. And a lot of the ones that are more expensive, if you buy it gently used, you can resell it for almost the same amount gently
Mhm.
used. You're pretty much breaking even on that. So worth
Yep.
keeping in mind.
Mhm.
All right. So let's see. What else does she say? On page 128, she talks about paid print subscriptions. She talks about both types of subscriptions, but I liked the print ones. I we just enjoy that. I think that's like a little
Mhm.
bit of a throwback to that. Oh, I got real mail, not just a bill. So we like magazines. We get a few different types of magazines. The kiddo especially likes the Week Junior. We're looking at possibly doing Oyla, Oyla. Have you done that one?
No,
I
but I've seen it.
Yeah, that's it. I've seen it a lot. They say it's for 12 and up. I figure we're probably about ready just because
Yeah.
we're us. Like he loves, I don't know, like we go to my parents' house and he likes looking at my dad's woodworking one, and there's Popular Mechanics. He loves old Popular Mechanics. There are all kinds of things that you can get. And so you can do the digital version for free a lot of times from different places, or you can get a cheap subscription yourself and working that in. And then it's for younger kiddos, but my kiddos is still really enjoying the Highlights USA geography subscription. So every month you get a thing. It's got a book with two states and it has state maps and activities and all of these kinds of things, and just like a fun way to learn about the states. Again, is it insanely cheap? No, but it's less than 20 bucks and it's something that comes each month and he's excited about learning about places, and it usually compares and contrasts to really different places. I wanna say it was maybe like California and Texas and like New York and Florida. One of these ones where you're like, "Well, that's interesting to learn about those 2 together in the same month." Like,
Well, and
yeah,
I
they're
think we're
just
coming
lots
up
of
on the
fun options.
holidays
Yeah.
too, and you're going to get a million people saying, "What does your kid want for?" And you're like, if people buy me any more crap that is going to clutter up my house and I have to replace batteries in every time you turn around, right?
Mhm.
But those are options that don't, right? That are
Mhm.
amazing. And so, yeah, they add up. But if you can get people to be like, this is a gift that they'll get every month for 12 months, and it'll constantly make them think of you and be appreciative and that they'll enjoy it and it's attractive and shift people thinking towards that, you can start making a list now.
Well,
Um,
yeah, no,
have it at the
exactly.
ready.
Totally, and that's like the Highlights US geography thing. It's perfect for that, right? Because I think it's $18 a month, but if you have aunt or uncle or a grandparent or someone who's on a bit of a fixed budget, but they don't wanna do a super cheap, it's much easier to spend $18 a month that auto bills on your credit card versus dropping $100, like, right then kind of thing. Makes it so much easier, and then for us, I don't know what other people wanna do with it or how they do it, but I just got a 3-ring binder with the pockets that you can put the booklet in. And then I got a couple old school photo pages, like for printed photos, and the
Mhm.
fold up maps go in the photo pages. So it all lives there together. And when we're talking about different things or we're talking about going on a road trip, he can go and grab that binder. He's got all of the maps right there. And so it's not because that could also happen in our house, right? Just maps laying everywhere. We have maps for everything everywhere. So trying to contain those, I understand the struggle, but it doesn't have to be
Yeah,
as
you
much
can
of a
put a
struggle.
system into place.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, I love those ideas.
Yeah. All right. So we're there's just a lot of little things, right?
All right, so we're about to move on to chapters 10 and 11, which are so short you could
So short.
sneeze
Yeah.
and miss them. So they're super tiny. But before we do, we just want to remind you that you can come hang out with us both on Facebook in our Facebook group and on Patreon. You can search Homeschool Moms Unfiltered in either place for additional support, for community, for resources, for all that good kind of stuff. So we live in a world where, unfortunately, we were just talking about how unhealthy social media can be, right? But the reality is, there are so many things that don't unlock for us as a podcast until we have a certain number of likes and a certain number of followers and all that. So hang out with us just wherever. Like us wherever you are right now. Review us wherever you are right now. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, whatever. Let's just hang out, right? Come hang out with us.
Yeah.
It helps us be able to continue to bring more content. So thank you, thank you, thank you. So, chapter 10, create a homeschool lesson plan. She talks about information here. So, Amanda's not going to like this. So, she talks about homeschooling, having to create a homeschool lesson plan. And I'm like, where she lives, that is necessary because they're very documented in New York. But just to like truly, they're not mandatory in most places. You can create one if you find it helpful or if it's required in your state to do so. But if you're not creating one and it's not required of you and you're like, oh, I'm terrible at this, yeah, that's not necessarily the case. I have no homeschool lesson plan and my kids are doing great. So there's a component of what works for you as long as you're within the law.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I will say, oh, so I did want to read it out. So for her lesson plan, she says, "What is a lesson plan?" And it's got these things. It covers these questions. What is the topic I'm focusing this lesson on? What is the primary purpose or goal of the lesson? What resources and materials do I need to teach the lesson? How do the activities draw on the strengths, needs, and interests of the learner? How can the lesson I'm teaching be generalized to the real world? If you wanna do this, again, by all means, go for it. If you wanna be super proactive of, "I'm putting together this history lesson, and we're gonna do this, and we're gonna go here, and we're gonna do that," again, by all means, rock it out. If that's your jam and that's what makes you happy, I'm happy for you. I don't have that energy. You know what my history lesson is? My history lesson is whatever it says to do on day 1, which is actually read this chapter, and in our case, listen to this chapter audiobook. On day 2, it's do this map and listen to this fun story that's related to the audiobook chapter. On day 3, it's a craft or a recipe or something else that I'm probably going to ignore because I don't have the crap to make it happen and I don't actually care. On day 4, we're going to do a review of the questions and it's got some like I can't think of the word, like the wrap up. Hey, did you actually comprehension questions? Like we'll talk through those. And on day 5, it's got recommendations of books that if I was on my game, I requested from the library a few weeks ago and they're just sitting there waiting to go. And if not, we don't do them. Right? Like I didn't plan any of that. That is when I opened the book and the book said I was going to do. It does not have to be like sit down and figure out what extra videos are you going to watch and how are you going to plan this and do you have the resources and do again if you want to do that like rock it out. It doesn't bother me, but it does not have to look like that.
Yeah. All right. The next thing I knew we were going to have a lot to say between us. And yeah, even, yeah. So I'll just start with it. Right on 134, she says, if the lesson can't be generalized to your students' everyday lives, then you may want to think twice about teaching the lesson. And I think we have, despite the fact that we homeschool so differently, some similar thoughts about that, right? I mean, I talked a little while ago about my kid researching like medieval origins of kid skin leather. That's not, I don't know anyone who has that in their everyday life. Right.
Or needs to be able to whip that out. Actually, I love
Right.
these shoes because I think that they used a technique similar to medieval kid skin leather. Like,
Exactly. So I do think there's something to be said for learning things because you enjoy learning them, right? Not because they're necessarily applicable to everyday life, because maybe they become applicable to your everyday life because that's the life that you carve for yourself based upon those interests. I will say on the flip side, there was a lot when we were still tethering ourselves to traditional education years ago, where my kids would be like, they'd be working in a workbook. What's this thing? And I'm like, I don't freaking know. And so those were difficult for me because it was like, I have never used that in my adult life. And so when they're saying to me, why do I need to learn this? I was really struggling with beyond you might need it someday, which I think for me is a crappy answer. And so I'm of two minds on this particular topic, right? Like how it can be manifested in very different direction from the other.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that because there are things that are like, I mean, how important is that? We were just talking about that right now. Winston is doing a different, he had done spelling all the way through 8th grade in this one curriculum because he really liked these books, and so he just bombed through it. And now we have a new spelling curriculum that came with another ELA program that we got, and I was like, "Yeah, we'll just do it and see how it goes." And for the most part, he's enjoying it, but I'm like, "How much does it really matter if off the top of his head, he knows how to spell theoretical?" In what scenario is he typing theoretical that spell check isn't going to correct it for him
He's not
as
close
long as
enough.
he gets close?
Yeah.
Exactly. Like, how much is perfect spelling? And the thing is I was a pretty good speller. I think I generally am a pretty good speller, but this 5th grade list, like every week, there's at least a couple words on there that I have to double check the list to make sure that I spell it correctly when I double check how he spelled it. So I'm like, I'm pretty sure that this isn't actually like that important. For me, it's more important that he knows it, that he practices it. He has a general idea of like how you would spell the word and what the word means, right? It's a good chance to make sure that we're working on that. But like, how much do I care if he can spell them 100% correct? And they have this whole like, and here's your perseverance list. Make sure, like, I don't know how much I want to make sure we persevere on these words. So, like, from that regard, I do get it. But the flip side is, I just think last week we had this great guest on, Wit, and he talked about the importance of having just general breadth and depth of knowledge. And I think that's so important because there's so many things that when you're learning it, you don't know how it's going to apply, or people are going to reference things. And uh, an example that came to mind while I was thinking about this and writing up our notes, right, is just yesterday we had a pretty rough day. And my kiddo, Winston, was talking about how he had a Chernobyl meltdown. In fact, he said, "I'm sorry for having so many Chernobyl meltdowns." And when he learned about Chernobyl, it wasn't because it tied to anything in real everyday life. And I wasn't specific, we're not doomsday preppers or anything. So I wasn't specifically, you should learn about Chernobyl because when it happens the next time, we want to be prepared. Uh, but he's applying it. And yeah, he's using it in a little bit different context, but it's an appropriate context. And
Right.
I think it's useful to have that kind of information, right? There are people out there that he might say that to, and they would be like,
Huh?
"Excuse me? Yeah, what are
Right.
you, huh?" And I mean, I just don't think we need to, that like dumbing down of society and like making sure all words are 5 letters or less. Like, we don't need to go there. We had that just the other day. We were at an event and this woman was talking to him and she said, "Oh, it's really quite cold." And he looked at her and he said, "Yeah, it's frigid. I really need my hoodie." And she was like, "Frigid, huh? There are better words than cold." It
Yeah.
definitely lets you know how he's feeling about the situation.
I and my 12-year-old is the same. I can be a bit of a word snob sometimes, like a written communication snob. I can also really, I can ellipsis with the best of them for a full paragraph at the same time. Not to say, but I one time when I was working in corporate America, still went to this HR seminar and it was on corporate communication. And that's what it was. It was about dumbing down language to make sure that we were communicating all on the same. And I was just like, no, I am not here for this. Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Not happening. So yeah, and it was being taught as like our new corporate principle for communication. And I was just like, I can't believe we're here. But yeah, for me, where that really resounds in that if the lesson cannot be generalized to your students' everyday lives, for me, that's more like if it's something that's not sparking interest, but you're learning it from the perspective of we just have to slug through this because this is the way it's done kind of thing. That's where I get torn on it. And I feel like for me, there's more gray area there. Yeah, why do we need this? Because you're allowed to question what we have been told is the complete package of education, right? You're allowed to be like, I am not going to learn past participle verbs. And I don't even know if that's a thing. I made that up. And instead, I'm going to learn about kid skip leather or the Chernobyl meltdown. So you have that flexibility with you and your kids and the whole thing. So yeah, it's tough. It's like trying to find that line of what's useful, what's not useful, what's interesting, what might come in handy later, what might not. I mean, it's hard to say sometimes, but you're
Yeah.
allowed to ask those questions in the homeschooling world, which is nice.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I do think the flip side of that is you can introduce something. Maybe you introduce geometry and your kids are like, I don't want to ever do anything that relates to this. And you know your kids well enough to be like, you're probably not ever going to
Yeah,
really need in depth geometry. So maybe you do a general kind of high level overview. This is what it is, this is what it includes. And if at some point in life you need to come back to it because you need it, you know where to go and you know where to start, but you don't need to become fluent in geometry, right? That's okay.
exactly. Yeah, I completely agree. All right. On 134, she talks about how to create a lesson plan, which was most of which was pretty straightforward, right? She's got give it a title for the lesson, a purpose or a goal, what materials and resources will you use. But I loved the fourth example or the fourth component of how to create a lesson plan, which was think of how your lesson will draw on the strengths, needs, and interests of your learner, as well as how the lesson can be generalized to the real world or future learning in high school or college. And I thought that's a great combination of what we just talked about, right? Where it's how does your learner learn best? How can you best get them this information? And then tie it to the real world or a potential use in the real world together, right? But there's so much freedom, I think, in that fourth bullet point as far as how you accomplish the thing. Even
Mhm.
if you're following state standards and you're like, I'm going to follow this to a T, great. But you can follow it however you want, right? There's
Mhm.
so much flexibility in the way you want to do that. So I loved that fourth example. And then she gives a template of what that looks like for her in written form and how she accomplishes her lessons. So helpful resource overall, I thought.
Yeah. Yeah, and that flows into my last comment for this chapter, which was on page 138. She wraps up the entire thing by encouraging parents to always make time to reflect on what worked and what didn't work with the lesson. And I just like that's pretty important in general, right? This idea of always paying attention to what is working and what isn't. To
Yep.
make sure that you're homeschooling successfully and happily, you have to be aware of this is working for me, but it's not working for my kid. Or this is working for my kid, but it's not really working for me. And what does that look like? It doesn't mean that you throw the whole thing out. It means you retool, you tweak, you figure out oh, something else to try in hopes that you get closer to something that works for both of you.
Yeah, I completely agree. We should just be doing that in general with all aspects of life, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's just there's always time to post mortem a situation and figure out what's working and what's not. All right. I'm super excited to kick off chapter 11, which is called Planning Beyond Your First Year of Homeschooling. So I'm going to read you a quote and I'll tell you what I thought because then I want you to share your thoughts, Amanda, because yours are more fun. So she's got this quote on page 141 that says the narrative that surrounds every adult who was homeschooled is generally the same: a highly successful, highly educated, civically minded individual who is curious, self directed, and entrepreneurial. Now, I get really suspicious of anything where it says every whatever or all this, right? Because it's really hard to make broad sweeping statements like that. So I made a note. I put my notes in our document before Amanda did. So my note says this is a little too broad of a statement. And I said we've shared stats about statistical trends showing that homeschoolers do well in the real world, but I don't know that would encompass every adult. What did you think, Amanda?
So I said, this quote is bullshit. Because there are entire advocacy and support groups out there for kids and adults who were failed by homeschooling, right? Like we cannot forget that. Yes, we're here week after week talking about how great and wonderful homeschooling can be and how homeschool kids grow up to become successful adults. And that's true. But of course, that isn't always true, right? I mean, a quick search of TikTok, I was just telling Megan, right? This is a big thing on TikTok right now and Reddit. There are like all of these horror stories about homeschooling gone wrong and people like really finding shared community about all the things that they didn't learn and they need to learn. And so I mean, we have to be realistic here. Yes, there's this idea, the genius, the prodigy that was homeschooled, and we hold them up and we will talk about that. And I'm guilty of that too sometimes. I mean, we have talked about it. There's nothing wrong with that. Just like there's nothing wrong with the regular kid who's homeschooling, the average kid who's homeschooling. The reality is there's still a significant percentage of people who are homeschooling in a way that does fail kids. And I don't think it does us any good to lie about that or pretend like it doesn't exist. Like we can advocate for the good stuff and also be realistic about the fact that we're not perfect and this community isn't 100% ideal and to be held up as superior in any
Ah,
way.
I think it's also important too, because if you're new to the homeschooling world and you're in a bunch of Facebook groups or vocal groups or anything like that, to understand that when people give you advice, they're coming from a really broad spectrum of
That's it.
homeschool success level and application, right? Consider the source. So
Yeah, that's
also
it. Sometimes
important.
it's so bad, right? Sometimes you're like, oh gosh, oh gosh, no.
Yeah. So it's there. But we have talked about statistics in previous
Mhm.
episodes, right? That have come from valid sources like the
Yeah.
National Department of Education, not like homeschoolers are us, that talk about homeschoolers doing well. And so she attributes this to a couple of different things. One is parental involvement in a kiddo's education, which that's not to say that people who send their kids to school are not involved in their kids' education. It might just look different or it might be a different level, but that's going to vary anyway within populations.
Yeah. But I mean, I
Um,
would say that's a across the board a true statistic because
yeah,
in
but even
public
public
schools,
school
yeah,
kiddos
in
do better.
public
Yeah.
schools as well, the schools that have the best test scores and have the highest rankings and all of that stuff, they have more parental involvement. And that's one of those socioeconomic barriers that
Yes.
really comes into play with public school, where both parents have to work and there's not a parent who's able to come in and volunteer in the classroom and isn't able to be there to help with homework every evening because of their family structure, right? Those kids suffer the most in that situation. I don't think it's
Yeah.
any different, right?
Yeah. Very true. She talks about lack of classroom burnout and a different view on how, when, and where learning occurs. And so I think that's just standard, right? We just talked about the fact that you can decide what works best for your kid, what works best for your family, how do they learn best, all of that. And the public school, most of the time, doesn't have the ability to do that. So if your kid's constantly feeling like a salmon swimming upstream with the way that they're receiving information and all of that, yeah, that's going to make a change. That's not to say that there's people who are Okay, rephrase that. Of course, there are people who are homeschooling who aren't homeschooling intuitively either. So again, you can't make these blanket statements, but as a general trend, yeah. And then the other is intrinsic motivation to learn, which I know you and I both have kids who enjoy learning, but that's not the case for all homeschoolers. And I
Mhm.
think it depends on how you're homeschooling and also how long you've been homeschooling and how long your kid went to public school before that. So we have a guest coming on next month who I'm excited to hear from, whose kids are in public school for a really long time and pulled burnt out, unhappy, stressed kids from the public school system and found a way to respark their love of learning, which I'm excited to hear their thoughts because you and I have never had to respark learning. We've had sparked learners. So,
Mhm.
and I feel like other people are certainly swimming that upstream battle. So it'll be helpful to hear those tips. I'm excited about that. Well, thank you for joining us today. So, just a reminder that our next book club pick is The Danish Way of Raising Teens. We will link it in the description below. So, if you do want to purchase it, you can read along with us. You do not have to read along with us if you're interested. So, yeah, tune in next week for a continuation. We've got, if you're new here, we have a topic episode every Tuesday and a book club episode every Thursday. So, follow along and you'll get notified every time we drop a new episode, which is pretty awesome.
Yeah.
So, have an awesome rest of your day and happy homeschooling.
Yeah. Have a great one.